countries created further common grounds for them. Additionally, the Indian diaspora settled on the continent since colonial times has been an important agent in this relationship. Since 2001, a lot has changed though. China and India have jointly contributed approximately 30% to global output growth and helped hold world output growth above the 4% threshold level. Their combined strong appetite for energy and metal in particular has boosted international price for commodities, directly affecting the volume and value of African exports. The resultant improved terms of trade have benefited sub-Saharan commodity producers and have fueled an average 4.2% growth rate for the region. The countries in Africa experiencing strong growth outside the oil-producing nations have been buoyed in part by global price increases in other primary export commodities. With the exception of raw materials whose prices have been relatively stagnant, other commodities including metals and non-oil minerals have experienced noticeable increases in their price levels. This worldwide rise of commodity prices has been engendered in large part by the rapid growth of China and India. They contributed close to 40% of global import growth for precious stones, 30% for crude oil, and 20% for metallic ores. Their demand for these commodities is likely to grow, or at least not change from current levels in the foreseeable future. Much of the accumulated stock of Chinese and Indian FDI in Africa has been concentrated in the extractive sectors like oil, mining, and timber. Despite the increase in national incomes, natural resources exploitation generates few job opportunities for the low-skilled and has limited effect on poverty levels. In fact, economic strategies based solely on raw commodities run the risk of impeding the development of the manufacturing sector by consuming all available financial resources and contributing to real exchange appreciation, the so-called Dutch disease. Obviously, a very noticeable trend during the colonization of resource-rich Africa. Excuse me. So, is this really altering the international division of labor? Or will this amount to the neo-colonization of Africa by China and India in this century? Not necessarily, but it remains to be seen and watched closely. In recent years, significant Chinese and Indian investments have diversified and are being made in other sectors like apparel, food processing, retail, farming, transport, tourism, telecommunications, etc. As a result, Asia now receives 27% of Africa's export, which is almost at par with Africa's exports to the United States and the European Union. Despite this rise, the 47 countries comprising sub-Saharan Africa account for only 1.8% of global investment inflows. With the exception of South Africa and Nigeria, the continent is comprised of countries with small and shallow markets. Africa's overall export market share has continuously fallen over the past 6 decades. Ironically, this decline has happened in spite of the fact that African countries have had preferential access relative to other developing countries into the markets of the North through a range of preferential agreements like AGOA and everything but arms agreement with the EU. Furthermore, despite some efforts, Africa's leading exports, particularly those that involve a higher level of processing, for instance, jewelry, garment, petroleum products, etc., face escalating tariffs in China and India. With further liberalization of the global economy and the reduction of subsidies, the developed country tariffs are coming down. The resultant leveling of the playing field is ironically having a negative impact on African producers. Most competitive emerging economies like China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Mexico, etc., are claiming an ever-increasing share of the global market, often at the cost of the less competitive African economies. In other words, the growth in the market share of emerging economies has rendered useless the preferential agreements between Africa and developed country markets. The most striking example of this phenomenon has been China's takeover of the global textiles and apparel markets, which is resulting in the closing down of once thriving industries in some of the poorest parts of the world. For instance, in Lesotho, which lost nearly 10,000 jobs in 2004 and 5 due to the closure of its 6 major textile mills. Incidentally, textile industry in Lesotho has experienced a resurgence due to the efforts of the MFA Forum. It's a network of companies, trade unions, NGOs, and international institutions working to alleviate the negative impact of the multi-fiber agreement phase-out. Lesotho and Bangladesh are part of an ethical trade agreement through the MFA Forum pilot program that aims to attract large brands and retailers to source from Lesotho. Additionally, Lesotho government is making concerted efforts to develop strong relationship with buyers, promoting Lesotho as a destination of ethical choice. Nevertheless, Lesotho exemplifies the point that the rise of competitive Chinese and Indian businesses have led to further displacement of African producers and firms both in domestic and export markets. India has been actively promoting trade with Africa in recent years. To boost the country's trade with the sub-Saharan African region, the government of India launched the Focus Africa program under the Export-Import Policy 2002-2007. Target countries identified were Mauritius, Kenya, and Ethiopia in the first phase. Government of India provides financial assistance, lines of credit, etc., etc. There has been increasing Indian investment in sectors such as tourism, pharmaceuticals, automobiles, electronics, computer software and accessories, information technology related products, and financial services within Africa. While African exports to India are petroleum, metallurgical goods, raw cotton, the usual unprocessed products. India is also participating in the construction of the future cyber city in Mauritius. India's increasing economic ties with South Africa are of note, since South Africa can be regarded as the economic giant on the continent. While it represents only 3% of the continent's surface area, it accounts for approximately 40% of all industrial output in Africa, 25% of the GDP, over half of generated electricity, and 45% of mineral production in Africa. Consequently, South Africa is regarded as the engine of growth for Africa and also a gateway for investment into sub-Saharan Africa. Additionally, since 1994, South Africa's trade with and investment in other African states has increased significantly. South Africa has consolidated its dominant economic position on the African continent through a deliberate regional and international strategy. Regionally, the specter of South African hegemony looms large on the continent, particularly exemplified by corporate South Africa's aggressive forays into the African market in sectors as diverse as mining, retail, telecommunications, and financial services. However, the notion of an ascendant South Africa or South African dominance is mitigated through a conscious approach of non-hegemonic regional cooperation and integration, and epitomized by quiet diplomacy and negotiated settlements. While the merits of quiet diplomacy in the face of the catastrophe in Zimbabwe in particular is questionable, this restraint has not led to passivity. Instead, South Africa has provided leadership to a number of ambitious regional projects, notably the concept of African Renaissance and the New Economic Partnership for Africa's Development, or NEPAD. African Renaissance can at best be interpreted as a philosophical and intellectual movement to find African solutions to Africa's numerous problems, or at worst it can be seen as an elaborate rhetoric. Either way, it is a laudable aspiration for a continent ravished by violence, poverty, corruption, and a useful ideological tool for South Africa to promote its leadership status on the continent. NEPAD, on the other hand, entrenches South African regional leadership by establishing it as an internationally recognized interlocutor for African countries. This is achieved through diplomacy at 2 levels. Firstly, by securing support for NEPAD within Africa, and secondly, through bilateral and multilateral contacts with industrialized countries to foster development within Africa through trade and development assistance. Internationally, South Africa's active engagement